My experience as a young person growing up in Houston, in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Houston, I didn't have a lot of guidance at home about what my life could be, and teachers stepped into that void and helped me understand that there were possibilities for me, and hopefully teachers continue to do that in all eras. One particular teacher who insisted that I could go to college, in spite of the fact that my family couldn't afford it, had gone to Dillard. And she also recognized in me an insufferably outspoken young person, and she still insufferably outspoken. And she said that she didn't think a Texas university, newly integrated, would be ready for me. And so I think they still aren't, actually. And so she wanted me to go someplace safe, and she determined that that would be Dillard. There I could continue to grow as a learner and as a person. And she happened to be right, by the way. And so I'm the youngest of 12 children, and the idea of going away from home was so terrifying to me. But because I trusted my teacher, I got on that train and went off to Dillard for an experience unlike any that I could have anticipated as a young person. So what was it like? First of all, the daughter of sharecroppers, I couldn't have imagined a place for African American students. I grew up under Jim Crow, and the outlook for young people at the time who were Black wasn't good. And so when I got to Dillard and saw the campus, I could not believe my eyes, because here was a pristine, beautiful, manicured campus across which were walking all of these young people who owned the place, and it was there for them. It had been created for them, and it was there to shape them in their lives. And that in itself meant something to me as a young person coming from Houston. But of course, being insufferable, I immediately proceeded to do things that were insufferable. And so my first year was challenging because I was very critical of everything, as many college students are. And so I was quite opinionated. Dillard is a was a church-supported institution. And of course, what do you do in a church-supported institution? You go to religious ceremonies, right?
Absolutely.
I remember once I visited, I was asked to go to I shouldn't even tell that story, but I was asked to go to Notre Dame to open up the school year. And I thought, well, okay, well, this would be nice. I'll just go out there and do my speech and I'll come back. But no, as soon as I finished my speech, they ushered me into Mass, because that's what they do at Notre Dame. So at Dillard, we had chapel, required chapel. And we had to dutifully go to chapel, a religious ceremony, and that was a part of our requirements at the university. Well, I said to myself, but that's unjust. You mean that this is a Protestant ceremony, and Jews and Muslims and Catholics have to go to a Protestant ceremony? So I said, that can't be. And so I decided to boycott chapel. And of course, there were no Jews or Muslims there. But that didn't matter to me.
Yeah.
It was the principle of the thing.
It was a principled stand.
And so that was my beginning. And I think because of the environment, I could do things like that. I could be outspoken. And although people acknowledged that it was weird, They protected my ability to grow into the person that I wanted to become. And because I had grown up in an environment where people had no rights, what was most important to me? That we protect people's rights, right? And so that as a young person, that just seemed to me so logical. So I started there, and then I decided, well, this is very good. I now know what the world can be. I'm on a campus, I'm learning, I'm being supported by teachers who care about me, but I need to know more about the world. And so I got on a Greyhound bus at 17, almost 18, and went to Mexico to live with a Mexican family and to study Spanish. Now, if you remember now, people already think I'm weird. So, everything I did thereafter just was confirmation, basically.
And to that point, right? So you went, as you said a little bit earlier, you went from not knowing too much about the world outside of Houston. You go on to Dillard, and then you end up going to Harvard to study French.
Yes.
How do you get from that point to going to Harvard to study French, and what do people say when you decide?
It's so logical. Okay, so what happens when you're so constrained as a child? When people tell you you cannot do this and you can't do that and you can't go in that door and you can't go in this door, what do you long for? You long to understand what the world is like outside of those constraints. And I discovered in college that one way of beginning to understand more about the world was to study language. And so I focused on studying language, and I majored in French as an undergraduate. And then I should confess that really, because of my boycotting chapel, the university decided they would not allow me to graduate from Dillard. It was my good fortune that in my senior year at Dillard, I won a Fulbright and a Danforth Fellowship, and I got into Harvard. And it became awkward for the university not to have me graduate. and so I managed to graduate. But it seemed to me that language offered immense possibilities for understanding the world, because if you've been hated for no reason, what you want most is to find a way to understand why people hate and to find ways of cutting through that bias and understanding how culture and language shape people. And if you can understand that, maybe you can figure out how to mediate all of that. So that's what I was after. So I went off to, when I majored in French, again, people thought that was really ridiculous, right? And then I went off to France for a year on my Fulbright, and I came back to Harvard. And when I went to Harvard, I was surprised to find that the faculty there thought I was odd too. Because what was a black girl in the early 70s doing, studying Proust and Gide and obscure French writers? What was that all about? It must indicate some fault in my character that I chose that instead of choosing social work or law or something practical for the times, because it was a moment when people thought, if you're black and you're being educated, well, you should be immersed in the civil rights movement and doing something practical to advance society, right? They couldn't understand how French could possibly do that. Yeah. And so I kind of wandered around Harvard thinking that, well, yes, it might be odd, but I was going to do it anyway. And I had already begun to believe that universities offered something different for me. They offered the opportunity to be in a reasoned space where people could debate issues and where people could be enlightened. And so I chose university life and a career as a professor because I wanted to be a part of that. It was so different from my early experience in life, and I wanted to be a part of that forever. So that's what I did. went to Harvard and wandered around Harvard Yard with people thinking, you don't stand a chance, right? But I was recently back at Harvard, and I noted this recently. Harvard asked me to give the commencement speech a couple of years ago, and they brought me back to Harvard and they wanted to honor me. But I'm on stage, and they're reading a citation, which was lovely, and I'm trying to reconcile the two. And I'm looking out over the audience in Tercentenary Theater and thinking, yes, but when I was here, I wasn't seen as anything very promising. And so I wandered around this very space, feeling different, marginalized, and so forth. And now I'm back trying to tell you what to do, and being celebrated. Yep. So I spend a lot of time in my life trying to reconcile the way we perceive things, the mistakes we make in judging, and what we can ultimately obtain by careful work and by generosity. That's fascinating to me, and so I really believe I'm very dedicated to the work that they do at Harvard today, and I've been very involved with as an alum for most of my career. But I'm a believer. I'm just a believer in what we can do if we are open-minded, if we reach across the space between us, and if we are able to grasp what there is that's fundamentally human about us all. There's so much we can do together.
Yeah. I want to, feel free. I want to talk about African American studies for a second. Knowing we've talked about this before, how you became the director of the African American Studies program at Princeton.
Yes.
But one of the things so one, I'm going to ask you to tell that story. But I also want to ask about what it takes to make a program rigorous, right? Because one of the things that you wanted to ensure with that program was that it was a rigorous program. So can you talk to me about how you became the African American Studies director at Princeton after studying French and not necessarily having that relationship to the field?
Well, at the time that I was at Princeton, there were very few African Americans, certainly on the faculty. And so the university asked me to become director of Afro-American Studies. Of course, I was incensed when they asked me. And so I had a wonderful soliloquy of protest about their daring to ask someone who knew nothing about Afro-American Studies to lead Afro-American Studies. They knew I had a degree in French. They knew I taught French, and yet Afro-American Studies was so, they were so indifferent to quality in Afro-American Studies that they would be willing to put any black face there as the leader of Afro-American Studies. So I gave them a very hard time and said, I will absolutely not do it. I know you wonder how I survived in my career, right? So they came back to me later and said, okay, what would it take for you to do to lead Afro-American Studies? So I thought about it, and I said, but there's one thing about me that is true, and that is, although I don't know anything about Afro-American Studies, I care about it. Mm-hmm. And therefore, there must be some good I could do in leading it. And so I went back to them and I said, there are 8 things that I need from you to agree to direct Afro-American Studies. And if you say no to any one of them, I will not do it. And so I ticked off the various things that I would need to be credible as a director. They said yes to everything because there were no more black people that they could ask. All right. And so they said yes to each, and I agreed. And the first thing that I did was to think about what matters at Princeton with any field is the quality of the faculty. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. They have world-class faculty in a lot of fields. In fact, it's the university at one time in this country that had every single department in the top 10 ranked. The only university in the country to have that. That's how important quality is at Princeton. And so I made a long list of people who I thought measured up to that quality. And I went after them. And my first was Toni Morrison. That was a challenging one because one of the things we do in universities is we're pretty elitist, which it's sort of okay, but it's not okay if you're missing tremendous opportunities because you have no longer the capacity to understand and see quality. Then it's really no good. And so Toni Morrison at the time was on the faculty of SUNY Albany. Well, Princeton doesn't recruit from SUNY Albany. And she didn't have a PhD. So bringing her to Princeton as a full professor, people objected to that idea. But we had a wonderful, courageous president at the time who just mowed people down and made it possible for her to be appointed. And she was appointed, and shortly after she was appointed, she won the Pulitzer. But then she won the Nobel Prize. And suddenly, memory at Princeton changed. And she became, of course, they knew all along that she was worthy of a Princeton appointment. And of course, today, there's one of the main buildings on campus is Morrison Hall. And so she made a huge difference in the lives of so many Princeton students. It wasn't a matter just of Afro-American studies, but she mentored enormous number of writers. And in fact, Mackenzie Scott was her student. And she is now making tremendous contributions to causes influenced by this woman who was a wonderful, wonderful teacher. So the idea is that there are fields that we know less well than we should, but the ingredient for making them strong is always the same. And so I later became a dean of faculty there, and I could see the corollary between why physics was so strong and why other departments were strong. It's basic, and that is you have to have the capacity to understand talent and potential. And if you understand both, and you don't have narrow perceptions about what human beings can do, you can take flight in all kinds of ways. I remember math was the #1 department at the time at Princeton, and it was lovely, but there was not a single bathroom in the building for women because there were no women. And so I remember I engaged the math department about this, and I said, well, what if we helped you recruit some women? They said, well, there are no women who are capable of serving at this high level in mathematics anywhere in the world. I said, oh, really?
In the world?
Yeah, in the world. So, I've been through a time where departments have absolutely refused to look at talent and potential. And as a consequence, for a long period, women were delayed in achieving certain fields because we would not admit to the fact that they had the capacity to the intellect, the powerful intellect that could match men. And that's why I set up the engineering program at a women's college, because I wanted to demonstrate that women could do engineering at a very high level, and I wanted to prove that they could even do it in a women's college. And I'm really proud of the work that we did there.
Yeah. In talking about the ways that the president at Princeton helped you sort of bring Toni Morrison onto the faculty, and then also thinking about when you were about to move into your role at Smith College, when they were recruiting you to be the next president, what were you thinking about leadership and what it took to be a college president when Smith approached you?
Well, I didn't think I was suited for it at all. I had been content to be the consummate outsider, always pointing out to institutions what was wrong with them. And I think I sort of settled into that role thinking that leadership was not for me. Secondly, because of my family circumstances, I come from a very poor family. My parents had an 8th grade education, and the one thing I never ever wanted to do is to present myself as being more worthy than they. And so I stayed away from sort of elevated positions that suggested that I was better than other people, because my mother always said, never think you're better than another person. And that sort of governed me. So when they came to me and said that they'd like for me to become President Smith, I said, I think you have the wrong person. I don't think you know who I am, because if you knew who I was, you wouldn't want me to be your president. But they stuck with it and eventually convinced me. And then more than that, my mentor at Princeton at the time was the person who gave me the worst possible time in my career, and that is, he was the dean of the faculty at Princeton. And I started working for him, and I did a spreadsheet, because my job was to oversee salaries for junior faculty. I gave him a spreadsheet, and he looked at it and said it was the worst thing he'd ever seen in his entire life. And to emphasize how disgusted he was with my work, he kicked the file cabinet. Well, he was a huge man, very, very, and a physicist. And I, went to my office and put my head on the desk and cried. And then I got up and I fixed it. And that getting up and fixed it changed my life. Because first, he was the first person who'd ever been honest with me, not patronizing me as a black person or a woman, but telling me the truth. And what a gift that was. Well, the same man, when he heard that I was going to turn down the Smith job, took me to lunch and told me what an idiot I was. So he really convinced me that I should go ahead and do it. And he was right. It was, they didn't force me to do it in a way that separated me from myself and from my community. And that was very important.
Yeah. You've talked about the ways that throughout your career, you were always advocating for excellence, right? If you were going to do something, you were going to do it the right way. We have a question from the audience that says, can you talk about the perception of strong black female teachers, and that could sort of move into strong black females or strong black women being seen as angry black women, right? Can you talk about that?
Well, it was sometimes we're angry. When I think about the ways in which African American women have had to protect their children, advance their communities, take an enormous amount of denigration. My mother and my sisters worked as maids. And I remember as a child, my mother took me with her to work a couple of times. And when I watched her work, I thought, how is it possible for her to do the work that she's doing and to be treated the way she's treated and still be such a wonderful, caring person? I was fascinated by that. But black women often have had to do double duty. They've had to do a lot of difficult things, and they've had to learn to be assertive in order to get anything done. And so what I often say, however, to the young women that I mentor who look angry, I really give them a hard time about that, because it is sometimes hard to let go of the anger when you've been mistreated so badly. And so many people come up through their education or through all kinds of different experiences, and they harbor that anger and are not aware that it's there, and you see it on their faces and so forth. So I think we do a great disservice to any person who has that anger, and we don't tell them how it reflects poorly upon the work that they can do. But we are also entitled to be angry. I want to say that, because in the face of some of the things that occur, anger is entirely appropriate sometimes. But you have to get beyond it, because the question is always not how can I continue to be angry, but how can I turn this into something meaningful that persuades people that what is occurring is not right, it's not just. And so I always encourage my students, turn to what the best course would be to teach, to help people understand. My students at Brown would sometimes come to me and say, Ruth, I'm just sick and tired. I just can't take it anymore. What is it? Well, I'm sick of people asking me about my hair and about the food I eat, and I just don't want to deal with it anymore. I just want to go somewhere and live with people like me, and not have to worry about people always questioning me and looking down on me. And they always left very shocked, because when they said that to me, I said, get over it, because your whole purpose in being here is to answer those questions for people. Why are you who you are? Why is your hair as it is? If you are not willing to share that, how will anybody ever learn? And so go back and take those questions, and sometimes when you get annoyed, say you're annoyed. But don't ever think that you're here to shelter yourself from what other people think and from how other people see you, because that's not what education is.
Yeah, So when you moved into that role at Brown, when Brown was recruiting you from Smith, it was a different situation, right? You had already served as the president of an institution. You'd launched an engineering program. You had done a lot of really, really exciting things at Smith. How was that move to Brown different? And then, quickly, how was that move different? And then I want to get into one of the initiatives that became, the sort of prominent chapter in your life story.
Well, it was pretty frightening, actually. I mean, I never expected to see an African-American president of an Ivy League university in my lifetime. That was my expectation. And to be approached about doing it posed a number of problems for me, because I was not the person that I would have thought would break through the ceiling. I was not that person. Everything was wrong about me. I was poor. I went to a black college. I didn't have the social kind of background that so many in the Ivy League have. So I thought I was just the wrong person, the wrong profile for that job. And so I told them that. I thought, I'm not really the person for you. But there was a woman at Smith who was on the board of trustees who came to me. I was still president at Smith, and she said, I want you to know that we would love for you to stay at Smith, but I can tell you that if you ever get a chance to become the first African-American president of an Ivy League university, historically, that's so much more important than being president at Smith. And that sort of released me to think about whether I had the courage to do it, whether I had the self-confidence to do it. I knew I didn't, but I thought it was historically important to do, because if I truly believed that all of these parameters that we create to block people from access, if I truly believed that we ought to upend those things and really judge people and their capacity on the basis of who they are and what they can do, rather than on some historical precedent, then I had no choice but to do it. So I ultimately agreed.
Yeah, and there's actually a question from the audience from Abby McGill that says, there's a through line of humility in your stories of being appointed to roles. Is that a key component of leadership, and how is that balanced with confidence?
Well, I mean, it's hard for me to see it as humility, because I see it more as, you know, I just have tremendous respect for people, for their stories, for the many different ways that we are formed as human beings. And I don't want to presume too much in terms of determining what they should be, because I want them to be that. And so because of the way I was treated as a child and told repeatedly that I was not, you know, I was ugly, I wasn't smart, I'd never go anywhere, and so forth, I understood at a profound level what it's like for human beings to be treated in that fashion. So I work hard not to treat people that way, always. And so I say to my students, don't ever presume that your professor, your chaired professor, is more important than the janitor who's cleaning your dorm. Don't ever presume that. Because every person we encounter has the possibility of influencing us in extraordinary ways, if we're open to that. And it's not about race, it's not about gender, it's not about what you have been lucky enough to get in your life. It's really about who you are fundamentally as a human being and what you can teach me. So I would say, on the other hand, that presidents and leaders who don't have any sense of being open to other people are usually not very successful. And, well, some of them are. But not long,
yeah.
Okay? Because generally we have a way of reconsidering leadership that is not appropriately open to other people. They may be good for a time, but when we think about how we assess them later, we often change our minds about the impact that they've had. So.
And speaking of the impact that they've had, when you got to Brown, you launched a committee that effectively has shaped the way that higher education has tried to reckon with its legacy of slavery since. Can you talk about launching the project to understand Brown's relationship with slavery and the pushback, right, or the sort of obstacles that you may have faced either from the community or from the board or whoever it may have been?
Well, I'm not so good at being calculating, and not so good at being politically astute, obviously. So I'm a new black president of an Ivy League university, and what's the first thing I tackle? Slavery. Right?
Got to do the thing.
There's a reason that there hasn't been another black person leading an Ivy university for 20 years, right? So for me, I'm pretty simple-minded. My approach is really not complicated at all. And so someone came to me and said that the founders of Brown were slave traders. Was that true? So I'm a new president, I don't know. And so I go to the history books and look it up. Nothing there. I go to the public relations person. I say, well, people are asking this question. Can you get information for me about it? No, it's categorically untrue, she said. And so there was this. There were those who said that these founders were slave traders, and there were those who said that that was an out-and-out lie. So it would seem simple to me. We just had to have the truth. And so how do you get to the truth? Well, I had a first-class historian who could lead a committee to investigate. And so I appointed a committee and asked them to come to the truth of it and to tell the community what the truth was. That's all I wanted. A lot of people interpreted that as related to reparations. A lot of people thought it was some kind of motive to, goodness knows what, I don't know. But there was a lot of distrust when it was launched, including among Black people. One of my very good friends called me and said she thought I had lost my mind. Because apparently when you're Black and you get to some vaulted position, you're not supposed to embarrass Blacks, okay, by asking difficult questions or ruining it for other people. So there were Blacks who thought, well, oh my God, this woman has gotten this position and now she's going to ruin it for the rest of us by asking these difficult questions. Didn't matter to me because I just wanted to know the truth. And so they did that work. It was difficult at first because people were very polarized on the issue of whether or not this was a good thing to do or not. But thankfully, we had real scholars involved, and they knew how to do it. So here's the thing. The Brown family were slave traders, but they were also intellectuals. And they kept meticulous records of everything that they had done. And those records were buried in the archives at Brown. And so what the committee did first was to begin to have exhibitions and just show the material. They didn't have to tell the story. All they had to do was to show the material. And the story was told. So we did that. It took quite a long time to do. But there are a number of different things that I had decided to rule out as a possibility. And I told the committee right away, don't come to me with a recommendation to change the name of Brown University. That's not happening, okay? I said, don't come to me with a recommendation that I should apologize for slavery. That's not happening. So I gave them a whole list of things that I would not have anything to do with, and so on. And they came back several times and said, would you reconsider? They really did want me to issue an apology for slavery at Brown. But I thought there was something terribly incongruous about that, and I wouldn't do it. But they had some very good recommendations, and one was we should memorialize this so that we're no longer liars to our students. We are vowing this is part of our history. It happened. And these are the consequences of it, and we want to memorialize that. So the idea was for henceforth to tell the truth. Because if you cannot believe universities are truth tellers, what can you believe about the work that they do? And so every university is obligated to remember the call to tell the truth, because we are so skeptical often about institutions. And about political figures. Well, okay, sometimes we are because we just don't believe what they do. We can't trust what they do. We have to maintain trust with our students and with the people the society that we serve. We have to. And so I think it has now proved to be a very successful study, and it's been imitated many times since.
Yeah. Thinking about that mission that institutions have to tell the truth, right? We're currently in an environment where political figures are actively trying to reshape higher education systems, trying to reshape the mission of higher education institutions, whether that's through appointing ideologically directed boards or whatever it may be. Can you sort of square that fundamental mission of an institution with the environment that we see, the environment we see in America now?
Well, it is in many regards a troubling environment, because you can say a lot about American higher education, and we often do when we're comparing American higher education with higher education in the rest of the world, and people often tout the success of other educational systems because the students are performing at a very high level and so on. But there's one area in which we have always been supremely well qualified in this country, and that is the independence of higher education and the fact that we have allowed fields to flourish without interference from the government. We've allowed new discoveries without interference from the government. And now, if that is in jeopardy, we will look more like China, we'll look more like countries in the world where the government dictates what you can do in a university. And is nobody fearful of that? I am. I'm very fearful of that, because I think the great strength of American higher education is that it flourishes because scholars are protected to do the work that they need to do. And some of it may be not as good as other areas, but overall, since the Second World War, look at the things that have happened through American higher education. And we don't want to risk that. I certainly don't want to see that risked, because people want to have a political agenda to upend subjects that they don't like, ways of teaching that they don't like, a culture that they don't like. And so this recent effort to shut down any reference to diversity on college campuses, that probably wounds me more than any, because I lived through the Bull Connor and George Wallace era. I lived through that. And I understand how long it has taken us to be free of it. And if for us to go back to politicians standing at the schoolhouse door, barring ideas, barring methods, barring freedom, I can't, it takes my breath away. I can't imagine what the world will be like for us in 25 years if we don't stand up to it.
Yeah. And for college leaders, what does standing up to it look like?
Well, first of all, as college leaders, our first mission is to protect the ability of our institutions to do scholarship that's unconstrained, okay? Unconstrained. And that means that when people come in to impose restrictions on them, we have to stand up for them. And we have to do everything we can to support the idea that a scholar, now, I mean, think of it, since universities were founded, scholars have been trying to find their way to truth and to discovery, right? And there have been through history moments when monarchies or others have tried to interfere with that freedom. And we've survived it. And we've continued to be strong over time because the public has generally understood that, yes, we do some crazy things in universities. I mean, really, they used to, well, we do. I mean, they used to cite, courses on basket weaving as the sort of metaphorical reference to the silliness that we engage in. But the test of whether or not we are silly is how well we are thriving in terms of our intellectual productivity. And when we stop producing, then people have a right to say, well, it's not really working. But I don't see any evidence that that is waning in this country, because great universities are continuing to be great and to protect those scholars' ability to do ambitious things. And most of the discoveries more recently that we have seen extend life, solve problems, deal with disease in an incredible way, pandemics and so forth, all the fields that have arisen, all of that is due to the capacity, the freedom of institutions to be able to create new fields and to advance those fields in unconstrained ways. That's what we have to fight for, that's what we have to stand up for, and we need all of the help from the community to assist us in doing that. And I think more and more, my sense is that that a lot, look at a lot of the great research universities, Johns Hopkins. Bloomberg gave $1 billion, more than that really, to Johns Hopkins.
1.4.
Okay. To protect the ability of that institution to do the work that it does. And we're all going to benefit because of that. And so I think in this next transfer of wealth, you're going to see a lot of those dollars. Mackenzie Scott gave $50 million to Prairie View. You're going to see a lot of that kind of activity, because there are people who understand that protecting the ability of universities to do that work is all important.
Yeah. Actually, speaking of that, that kind of philanthropic environment, the funding environment, how has the funding environment, particularly for HBCUs like Prairie View, how has that environment changed over the last couple of years, even from the last couple of years, but also just kind of thinking about it in the larger continuum of funding for HBCUs? How is this moment different than it has been in the past?
Well, of course, we know that over history, HBCUs have been generally starved for funding. And that's been part of the whole process of really suggesting that anything that is focused on a particular group, not just HBCUs, but others, doesn't really deserve the same kind of funding that other institutions get. So there's been a thought that HBCUs really don't deserve significant funding, because after all, the people in HBCUs are not, smart enough to be able to take advantage of the same kinds of things that that students in other universities can take advantage of. And I won't call that what it is, but it's manifestly a very pernicious way to see the world. But more recently, we've seen a surge of support for HBCUs from corporations, from private donors, from the government, from really across the spectrum. So in a way, I feel as though HBCUs are just on the verge of living the life they should have been living probably 60 years ago, 70 years ago. They've been held back a good deal. So I'm very interested in the project of seeing HBCUs supported at an appropriate level. There are people who believe that certain students are entitled to the best in education. I've never thought that. I've always thought that all children are entitled to the best that we can give them in education. All children. And so whether it's our public schools, or whether it's our junior and community colleges, or whether it's our great universities, I want to see every student benefit from the maximum quality that they can find their way to. And I like to remind people that we talk a lot about the high-profile universities, but keep in mind that there are people every day who move from community college to leadership roles, and who do outstanding work. I don't like the way that we categorize people. I don't like the way we categorize institutions to suggest that just because I went to Dillard, for example, I can't be president of an Ivy League university, okay? So we need to really be careful.
Absolutely. We have time for about 2 more questions. We have one from the audience. It says, can you speak to the conversation that's taking place about the value of humanities degrees compared to credentials more directly linked with the workforce? And this actually kind of gets to what you were saying about institutions having the opportunity to have expansive course offerings and have expansive fields.
Well, I mean, don't ask a humanist about about this, because, you know, if I had my druthers, when I was, as I said, when I was young, people thought, well, you know, it's just so impractical what you're doing, Ruth, that, you know, you can't, you're doing French, and what is that going to lead to? Well, I mean, I learned how to think. I learned how to reason. I learned how to interpret. I learned how to deal with people. I learned all kinds of things that have enabled me to do a tremendous range of things. And so, yes, I'm a humanist, but I served on the Goldman Sachs board. I'm chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Houston. I have, well, pretended to know something about a lot of different fields. And I'm incredibly intrigued by and interested in all of that. So what to me humanities enable us to do, along with other fields, is to understand fundamentally the human condition. That's the thing that's so important. And what are we missing so much today? That understanding. And what is preventing us from is preventing us from coming together as human beings in one project for the world. And so the last thing in the world we should be doing is encouraging everybody to do technology and engineering and science when we need people who are going to be studying what it is that we have been throughout history and how can we do better as human beings. I'm very fond of E.O. Wilson's book, The Meaning of Human Existence. So here's a scientist, a meritologist, who concludes that human beings are so evolved, and yet they cannot do what ants do. Okay? That should worry us, right? Because our survival as a species and the survival of the world depends on our ability to do what we're doing now, and that is to reason with each other, to be concerned for each other, to look out for people who are different from us, and so forth. If we cannot do that as a human race, what is left for us? I'm terrified for my granddaughter when I think about that, because I know so well how meaningful it is to be a part of a project that allows you to learn about people who are just radically different from you. And to be able to appreciate the aspects of their life that are so enlightening. One educational experience that I had that I always remember is that I was in a class once, a classical philosophy class, and we were talking about apartheid for some reason, and everybody in the class was saying how awful it was and how corrupt it was. And then one girl raised her hand, a white South African student, and she began to defend apartheid. And I always say to people, today, I cannot remember a single person in that class other than that girl, because I remember that tremendous impact that her difference of opinion had on me. And so if we don't learn to appreciate what difference does for us, then we will not be able to complete this human project in the way that we want to.
Yeah. Another question from the audience: what advice would you give to women who are fearful of stepping out of the box and being seen as potentially weird?
Does the question really say that? I always say to the people that I mentor, there's one important thing you must remember. and that is, if people look to you and want you to lead, the last thing in the world you should do is to try to imitate somebody else. They're looking to you because of who you are. And so we are often the last people to see who we are and what people appreciate about us. And I came to terms with this when I became a president, because I didn't know how to be another person. And so I was saying to people, I can't be your president because I can't be like Larry Summers, okay? Larry Summers and I started at the same time. He was at Harvard and I was at Brown. I said, I can't be a Larry Summers. I can only be who I am. And to my surprise, people embraced that, although it's different and at times weird. And my students, I love my students because they always embrace the ridiculous things that I do. And so I chide them for doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And I say to them, you know, you're not working hard enough and you better not do this and you better, and so forth. So I can be a parent to them and they laugh, of course, but they understand it. I don't have to be different as a president to be their president. And I have so appreciated that about this profession. And the other thing is that people who see what I'm like in the academic world believe that I can't be a board member at Goldman Sachs, but I can. And I'm doing the same thing on the board at Goldman Sachs that I'm doing in my university context, because guess what? Financial institutions need our kind of people too, because we can speak to things that they may not be thinking of and that they may need to hear. So spread your wings, get into as many different areas as you can, but always, always, always bring your full self to what you do.
Ruth, thank you so much for this fantastic conversation. To all of you who joined us, thank you. To our interpreter, thank you. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.